Archaeology Master Planner for the Historic Preservation Section in the Prince George's County Planning Department of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. Now that's a mouthful. She received a BA in anthropology, a master's of applied anthropology, and a PhD in American Studies, all from the University of Maryland. Dr. Stabler has worked for the National Park Service on archaeology at the Peterson House, which was where President Abraham Lincoln was taken after he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, and cataloging artifacts recovered from archaeological investigations at several national parks. She has worked on a variety of projects in Annapolis, Texas, and Virginia. Dr. Stabler also spent many summers working on sites in Israel and worked at a Roman villa site near Orvieto, Italy. Did I get that right? Okay.
Yep.
Currently, I wasn't trying, the towns in Israel were a little defeating, so I skipped those, sorry. Currently, she reviews development applications for effects on archaeological resources and is working on the county cemetery survey that was started by the evening's chat host, Susan Pearl. We will be recording the chat, so please mute yourselves if Amanda hasn't already done that for you. And we will be doing a Q&A after the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and our moderator, Amanda, will pose the questions to Jennifer and Susan at the appropriate time. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer and Susan.
Well, we're really glad to welcome you to the second one of these conversations. This is going to be a grave conversation, as Donna told you, about historic cemeteries and graveyards in Prince George's County. During the years that I worked at the Park and Planning Commission, I got to know quite a few different cemeteries and graveyards, church cemeteries, family cemeteries, lost cemeteries, found cemeteries. But now since Jennifer has come, she's gotten really systematic about this. She's keeping close track of all these cemeteries, making sure that they are recorded and protected, and she'll have some really interesting things to tell you about them. I thought at first, hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Susan.
We'll start out just for a very short time on a place that may be familiar to most of you. I hope so. The Calvert family's Riversdale Plantation in the Riverdale Park, College Park area. You probably know the house, now a museum house, and you may not have visited the cemetery, which is just over a quarter of a mile northwest of the house, a little farther away from the plantation house than cemeteries usually were. But this cemetery is outstanding for the artwork on Rosalie Steer Calvert's altar tomb. Can we have the first slide?
Jennifer, you're muted. Amanda, can you unmute?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I was sharing my screen. Is it not coming up?
Not at the moment. Go ahead and give it a try again.
Oh, geez. I was afraid this was going to happen.
Well, you'll soon be seeing a picture of Riversdale and then a picture of from the cemetery where you'll get a look at the very specific sculpture on Rosalie Steer Calvert's altar tomb. I hope.
I hope so too. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know what happened. Now I can't get back into the. Okay, hold on. Let's try this again.
We're in business.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Sorry about that.
Happens to the best of us, Jennifer. Don't worry. It's all yours.
It looks. Can we go back one?
That's.
Oh, well, never mind. Never mind. This is fine. Everybody knows what Riversdale looks like. So here we are. This is what I wanted you to see. The sculpture is by Giovanni Andrei. He was a famous sculptor in Italy who was brought from Italy to assist Benjamin Henry Latrobe in the interior decor of the United States Capitol building. And when Rosalie, at age 43, died in 1821, George Calvert, her husband, who knew all the most important people in Washington, commissioned Andrei to design Rosalie's tomb. So you see her here. Her 4 of the 9 children that she and George Calvert had, 4 had predeceased her, and you see them welcoming her to heaven in this sculpture on the tomb. This is one of the, well, everybody's favorite tomb sculpture in Prince George's County, I think. Of course, there were many people, many families that worked and lived on these large plantations. Enslaved families and other workers, and in the case for most of them, we do not know where their families were buried. At Riversdale in 1934, during grading for the construction of a new house in University Park, which was part of the original nearly 2,000-acre Riversdale plantation, a group of burials was found. This was, as I said, part of the Riversdale plantation, so it's possible that this was a slave burial place. But we don't know, since it was so long ago, nearly a century ago, that this grave was disrupted and the skeletons were found. So the analysis is unknown if it ever was attempted. But Jennifer will talk to you about current work on another plantation. The Benjamin, oh, okay, sorry. We changed our order a little bit. So go back to Weston and we'll slip it in. We spent some time this afternoon rearranging things, and that's always dangerous. So I'm going to give you now a quick word about Weston. The Claggett family plantation just south of Upper Marlboro. You see the house here. Again, a large and prosperous family. In this case, the family cemetery was quite a bit closer to the plantation house, only about 800 feet from the house and almost directly in front of it. We have a wonderful comment about this cemetery, and that's why I decided to tell you about this. The Claggetts brought in a governess from Vermont to teach the numerous children of Thomas Claggett VI, and she, very fortunately for us, wrote home often. In one of these letters that she wrote just after she arrived at Weston in 1854, she wrote home about her new place, and I quote, "The house stands on a hill, and the grounds are thought very fine here, of one of the wealthiest of the wealthy planters of Prince George's. It has a view of other hills covered with grain and tobacco fields. One of them is crowned with the old family burying ground, the most conspicuous object in the landscape in front of the house. It is the first thing my eyes behold when I approach the window every morning, always with a hope that it may not be my fate to be buried there." End quote. Okay, next one. As I started to say, I think I'm going to turn this over now to Jennifer, and we can talk about some of the others a little bit later. She's going to tell you about the Benjamin Duckett plantation. And go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, first I just wanted to give some statistics for what we know so far. So far, we've documented from what Susan's work and the continuation of the work that we've been doing after Susan retired. We've identified 104 family cemeteries, 45 church cemeteries, 25 African-American church cemeteries, 9 that are public or commercial, 2 Jewish cemeteries, 1 institution, and 6 slave cemeteries. So one that I wanted to talk to you about is one that we actually found through the development review process. This is the Benjamin Duckett plantation. This plantation was located where Route 50 and Enterprise Road meet. It's the northeast intersection of those 2 roads. So back in 2007, we received a development application for the development of this property. Originally, it started out as a subdivision. And so we recommended a phase 1 survey. And the phase 1 survey was also recommended by the Maryland Historical Trust. And they reviewed this property because there was a stream crossing, which you can kind of see right here in the center of the property. So anything that involves Army Corps of Engineers wetlands permit, which would be required for the stream crossing, they review because it's a federal permit. So both of us, required the phase 1 survey. And so during the phase 1 survey, there were about 3 or 4 sites that were found on the property. And there were a couple of small prehistoric sites that were found over in this area that were heavily disturbed by subsequent occupation of the property. But there were 2 sites. There was one site up here, and then there was another one back here that had some, this one had some late 18th, early 19th century material in it, but there had been some houses built in this area, just to the kind of the south of the circle here, in the 1970s and 80s that kind of really disturbed that area. And then the site back here had some mid-19th century to early 19th century material and all the way up to the 20th century. So we thought, well, maybe that was the location of a slave cabin or something like that, that continued to be occupied by some of the former African-American occupants of this property after the Civil War. So we wanted to know more about both of these sites. So in the process of doing the research on this property, we're very fortunate in Prince George's County that all of our deed records are intact. We didn't have a historical fire in the courthouse, so our records are very intact and they go all the way back to the founding of the county. So I was able to determine that this piece of property was owned by Benjamin M. Duckett, who died in 1851, and his wife continued to live on the plantation, and after she died, it was inherited by some of her daughters continued to live there, and then it was sold out of the family in the early 20th century. But the will of Harriet Duckett, who was the daughter of Benjamin and Sophia Duckett, stated that she wanted to be buried as close to her deceased mother as possible, with one tombstone suitable for 3 graves for her mother, her father, and herself. And then a later deed that conveys the land out of the family set aside 1 square acre of property, and it stated where the family graveyard of Benjamin M. Duckett and his descendants were located. So we knew there was a cemetery on the property. But of course, this piece of property also extended across the other side of Route 50. So we knew there was one somewhere on the property. So when we looked at the 1938 aerials, you could see where I have circled down here, you could see this clump of trees, and everything else was pretty much field. So, and we looked at the topography, and there's kind of a raised area there. So we thought that must be the location of the cemetery. Then I also found a road plat for Route 50 that showed the location of a cemetery. So we're like, oh, that's the family cemetery. So we were confident at that point that we knew where the family cemetery was. So as the archaeologists continued with their work, the Maryland Historical Trust decided after the phase 1, they weren't really interested in the sites or didn't think they could contain significant information. But because we had our local review process, we asked for what's called a phase 2. So that's when the archaeologists open up, they put in test units that measure about 1 meter by 1 meter, and they open up the site a bit to see if there are features present or intact soil deposits. So in the process of doing that, they found a what looked like a well over in this area, and they recovered more late 18th century, early to mid 19th century artifacts. So we thought, well, that's probably where the house site was. Back here, it was more late 19th, early 20th century artifacts, and the building apparently had been burned at some point. But again, we thought maybe this was an African-American residence on the property. So we wanted to learn more about that. So after the phase 2, the developer's plans changed, and then they proposed to put a kind of a continuing care facility on this property where you have a nursing home situated here. And then as you move back, you have, I think these are condos, and then I think you have single family houses in the back. So at that point, we knew we had features on both sites. So we asked for what's called a phase 3. And that's when you try to gather as much information from these sites as you can by opening up the sites even more and finding more features and digging any features that you find. So in the process of doing that, I had been going out to the site pretty regularly when they were out there. So in the middle of one day, I get a text from one of the archaeologists out there. What does this look like? I looked at my phone and I'm like, oh my gosh, looks like a grave shaft. So what they had done, they had stripped some of the topsoil in this area over here, and they revealed what looked like several grave shafts. So I went out to the site and looked at it and it's like, yeah, that's what they are. And I'm like, how can that be? Because there's this other cemetery that we know about down here. And we always thought that that was the family cemetery. But actually a few years ago, a local resident called me, and I guess because he saw something mentioned about the cemetery survey that we were working on, and he said, do you know about that slave cemetery on the property over there? And I'm like, well, we know where the family cemetery is. Where was the slave cemetery? And he's like, well, I was always told it was up there by Route 50. I used to play over there as a kid, and I was always told that was the slave cemetery. So I'm like, okay, well, where's the family cemetery? Then we kind of wondered, you know, if that's the slave cemetery, could this possibly be the family cemetery? So here's a picture of, this is the 1938 aerial, and here's the clump of trees where the slave cemetery was located, which we thought was the family cemetery. And this is the area where eventually we determined the Duckett family cemetery was located. This was, the property was originally owned by the father or the grandfather of Benjamin Duckett, who was Richard Jacob Duckett. And he owned this entire property here. And it was this was later divided between Benjamin and his brother, Thomas S. Duckett. So anyway, that just shows you the extent of this plantation. And you see over here is Fairview, which Susan will be talking about next after I stop talking here, probably going too long. And then this is the 1861 Martinet map where you can see Mrs. Duckett and Odin Bowie over here at Fairview. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But so this was the first cemetery that we identified. And at that time, we thought it was the family cemetery. So the applicant hired some archaeologists to go out, and they didn't want to disturb the burials, but we wanted to determine what the extent of the burials were. So they dug a bunch of backhoe trenches, which you see in blue, around the cemetery. And what that does, when you strip off the topsoil, like I said with the other case, you will see if the soil has been disturbed, you'll be able to see that. So that's what we were hoping to find, you know, if any burials were located outside of what we thought were the confines of the cemetery. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything more in this area. So we were pretty confident the cemetery was confined to that hill. So when the other burial shafts were found further to the north, this gives you an example. The backhoe has a smooth bucket on it, so it doesn't dig into the soil. And the backhoe operator was really good. He would just pull the soil back, and you can see the flags that mark where these disturbances in the soil were located, where there were grave shafts. So the developer had already platted the property. And so you can see the cemetery was located right in the middle of a road that they had planned, and they had planned to bring the sewer right through the center of the cemetery. So we met with the developer, and we worked with them to revise their plan so that they could bring the sewer in around the cemetery. And now it is, along with the slave cemetery, will be preserved in place on the development. So I think I've probably talked a little too long. So let's, we can move on to Fairview. And actually, when I was doing some of the research for the Beachfield property, I came across a runaway slave ad that said the runaway slave, what he left, and he might be, the property owners were looking for this runaway slave, Benjamin Duckett, was looking for him. And he said he might be found at Fairview where his wife was living. So that shows you some of the connections between these two plantations. So Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yes, as you could see from the map, the two plantations, the Benjamin Duckett plantation and Fairview, are really right next to each other. And we'll find our way back to the Fairview slide, I hope. I just wanted to tell you a story about the Bowie family cemetery at Fairview. There's another place where we don't know where the slave burials might have been, though they could have been very close to the family cemetery, which you see in this slide. The detail is the actual burial place of Governor Odin Bowie. This was the home of two generations before the governor, who served from 1869 to 72, and then three more generations after. It's only recently left the possession of the Bowie family since the second Odin Bowie, grandson of the governor, died in 2012. But there's a wonderful story about it. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a picture of Anna Queen Holmes, who was, until her death not too many years ago, a member of the board of directors of the Prince George's County Historical Society. She knew that her great-great-grandparents, Basil and Lizzie Wood, had worked at the Fairview plantation and farm for all of their lives, and they lived long lives, nearly a century in each case, from the 1830s to the 1920s. And she wanted to know where they were buried, but she had no idea. They both died in the 1920s. So we encouraged her, and she went to Odin Bowie, young Odin Bowie, as I say, the grandson of the governor, about 10 years ago, and asked him. She told him about her great-great-grandparents and asked him if he had any idea where they were buried. And to her amazement, he said, "Oh, right there in the corner of the family graveyard." And we're sort of looking at it in the lower left corner of the slide of the graveyard there. It was an unmarked burial, but he said that's where they were. He remembered them. He remembered them from childhood because Lizzie, Elizabeth Wood, had been the family cook. And little Odin Bowie would run around the farm all day, and he would find himself going to Lizzie's house where she would supply him with cookies and gingerbread. So he remembered that family very well. And he told Anna right where they were buried. And with his permission, she designed and ordered a stone for her great-great-grandparents. And now when you go to visit the Bowie family cemetery, you'll see on the lower left, Basil and Elizabeth Wood in the corner of the Bowie family graveyard. Anna died just a few years after that, but she was a very, very happy person. Okay, what's next?
Okay.
Oh, good, Ridgely.
Okay.
You're on.
All right. I think I had these out of order, but
Oh.
okay. So the Ridgely Methodist Church, this is located on Central Avenue, just to the west of the Beltway. It was founded in 1871 and now includes a cemetery that was started in 1892. And the current church that you see here was constructed in 1921. This church was the spiritual and social center of the formerly rural African-American farming community that came to be known as Ridgely, in the area generally known as Landover, along Central Avenue. Lewis Ridgely held the first services for the congregation in his home. And then in January 1871, he and other trustees of the congregation acquired 1/2 acre from Thomas E. Berry, who lived at Concord, which is just to the not too far south and west of the church. So it was used as a place for the African Americans in the community to worship in the Methodist Episcopal Church. They began construction of the church in 1871 by hauling logs from the site to a nearby mill and bartering unneeded logs in exchange for the sawing of their lumber to build the first church. The one-room whitewashed building opened the following fall. So in 1892, the trustees purchased an additional acre from Betty Berry for divine worship and a cemetery. And so this is when we believe the cemetery was first established in 1892. The earliest graves are unmarked, just like a lot of the African-American cemeteries in the county. And the first carved headstones date to 1910. The original church burned, and what you see is the 1921 church that was built after the first church burned. When Central Avenue was widened in, I think that was the 1990s, the church was originally closer to the road, and it was moved back to its current location, which you can see here in the slide. Okay, so some of the stones in the cemetery are very unique. You can see some of the ones at the bottom here. It has this kind of this vine and flower motif. And correct me if I'm wrong, Susan, I think Mildred Ridgely Gray said that one of her uncles was the person who made a lot of these stones in the cemetery.
Yeah, I think so.
And so here's the gravestone of her parents in the back here. But if you walk through the cemetery, you can see that this motif shows up on a lot of the stones, and a lot of them are made of concrete. They're handmade out of concrete. So a few years ago, Mildred Ridgely Gray's daughter, Laverne, wanted to have a ground penetrating radar survey done of the property because they weren't sure where the extent of the graves were or how many graves were there. So Dr. Tim Horsley, who you may have heard about today, who is the person who helped define the 1634 settlement in St. Mary City, he also does a lot of GPR in cemeteries, and he's done quite a bit of work in Prince George's County. So he came out to the site in November of 2019, and he did a GPR survey of the cemetery. And in the process of clearing some of the brush, he found this stone that had been kind of choked by weeds and nobody knew was there. And he found a couple of others too, but it just has a very interesting symbol there inscribed on it. And it's made out of slate. So if anybody has any idea of what that, what some of the images on the stone mean, I'd love to know. Here's another stone. This one's from 1924, and again you see this vine and flower motif at the top. And again, this one's made out of concrete. Here's Dr. Horsley doing his thing. So he lays out a grid over the property, and then the machine that you see in front of him, he pushes that across the site, and it picks up anomalies in the ground. And so he does several passes over these lines that he's laid out, and then he has to download all the information and kind of make sense out of the data that he collects. And so this shows you in the church cemetery here, the red crosses note where burials have headstones. Those are all the headstones that were located. And I didn't include the picture of all the burials that were in the cemetery because I didn't know if I had permission, so I just left it out. But I do want to tell you that he found burials pretty much everywhere, especially back here, just about every square inch back here covered in burials. They go all the way up to the road. This one's very close to the road. So I kind of want, and then kind of slopes down. So I kind of wonder when they widen Central Avenue, whether they might have taken out some burials there. But anyway, there are burials that also show up all the way back here. They're all around in here. And I think the extent is pretty much right back here. He also found an anomaly inside. This is where the church used to be located. He did find an anomaly in here, but he wasn't certain that that was a burial. But anyway, it shows you what you can find. I will have a picture of a GPR, some of his, where it actually shows the burials a little bit later on when we talk about another cemetery. But it just shows you the power of GPR and its ability to find these unmarked graves. Okay, so I guess we'll move on to St. Thomas.
Okay, we'll go back to another church. This one is St. Thomas at Croom. Let's look at that for a while. South of Upper Marlborough in the village of Croom. I hope you know it. I hope it is familiar to you because it is, I think, and so do other people, the prettiest church in Prince George's County. Now, I'm particularly interested in it because I've been working on a series of 3 diaries that were written during the Civil War by John William Burroughs. There he is, and there you have a look at a couple of pages of the diaries that he wrote. He lived at Waverly, which was right near Croom, and he served on the vestry of St. Thomas at Croom. In 1862, while he was serving on the vestry, he wrote something in his diary about the cemetery at St. Thomas. His mother died in June of 1862. His diaries cover 1861, 62, and 63. So we know from other sources that she died on June 15th, 1862. But strangely enough, in the diary, the entire month of June is very carefully cut out of the diary. But he returns in October, and at that time, actually in part of September, but in October, he begins to write something about the cemetery, the St. Thomas Church graveyard, and the family plot that is being planned at the cemetery. On October 4th, he writes, quote, "Went to Nottingham to see if the vessel has come with the iron railing for the churchyard. It has not come yet," end quote. Nottingham was the port on the Patuxent River, very close to Croom. And this is where any purchases from Baltimore would have been delivered to the people who lived near that part of the Patuxent. On October 18th, he writes again, quote, "Sent teams down to Nottingham to bring up the iron railing for the lot at the church." Now you can change the slide. And on October 20th, he says, "I went over to the church. Mr. Gaddis is fixing up the iron railing on our plot." And there you see it. The ornamental railing that surrounds the Burroughs family plot in the lowest photograph. The stone that was set up for his mother, Caroline Clarissa Smoot Burroughs. You can't quite read it, but that was her stone when she died in 1862. If you look far away in the plot and in the little picture at the top right, that's the tiny little obelisk that was set up for Willie, the Burroughs little boy who was born in 1861 and died in 64, only 3 years old, but he had a tiny obelisk there in the Burroughs family plot. So Jennifer's going to tell you about St. Simon's, right? Which is, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot my favorite slide.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave that out. I always, when I go to St. Thomas, I always look for this stone. I hope you can read it. I don't know who Leona May Williams was. She died in 1989, but she says very clearly on her gravestone, "I'd rather be dancing." Okay, take it from there, Jennifer.
Okay, so now we'll move to St. Simon's, which was a mission church of St. Thomas. It was built in about 1896 originally on the grounds of the St. Thomas Episcopal Church Rectory. It was moved to the south side of St. Thomas Church Road in 1902. You can see it on the left here, up at the top. On about 1/4 of an acre. There are approximately, here you can see at the bottom of the screen, the graveyard associated with St. Simon's was about 1/4 mile south of the church here. And it holds right now about 70 marked graves and an unknown number of unmarked graves in the cemetery. So this would be an ideal candidate for a GPR survey to try to identify a lot of those, some of those unidentified burials, just like in a lot of our African-American cemeteries. A lot of them had permanent markers that, that decay and are gone now. So the ones that were marked by these temporary markers are, we don't know where they are anymore. So GPR would be the perfect tool to find more burials here. The St. Simon's is significant. It's one of only 2 Episcopal chapels that were established for African Americans in Prince George's County in the 19th century. The earliest grave marker in the cemetery dates to 1929, and the most recent burial dates to 2005. And the grave markers include concrete and marble tablets, bronze and granite flush plaques, and 13 concrete crosses, some of which you can see here. So in 1964, St. Simon's merged with St. Thomas's congregation, and the chapel was demolished in 1972. Now, there is a local resident who has done what we call some dowsing in the cemetery. And he told me that he identified a cluster of graves at the end of the driveway, which would be over in this area here. It's off the screen, but that's where you drive in and you park, and then you walk over to the cemetery, which is to the east of the driveway. So that kind of makes us wonder, and it's so far from the church, St. Simon's Church, it's about 1/4 mile away. Could this have possibly started out as a slave cemetery, and then maybe some of the people who attended St. Simon's, maybe they were related to these people here and wanted to be buried in the same location? I mean, that's kind of a question I have of a lot of these African-American churches and cemeteries, whether they might have started out as slave burial grounds first, and then they later became family cemeteries or church cemeteries. Okay, so Susan, you want me to cover Mount Nebo or?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
yes.
So Mount Nebo is another African-American church. It's located in, Queen Anne. It's located near Queen Anne. And just recently, what was that, last week, Dr. Tim Horsley came by, and the church got a grant to do a ground penetrating radar survey in this cemetery. And again, like many of our African-American churches, there are some markers in the cemetery, but there are a lot of places where there are no markers, and there are obviously depressions where there are graves. And so some of the grave diggers who are quite old and have dug most of the graves in the cemetery said that the property kind of slopes down in the back. Told us that that's where a lot of the paupers were buried. So people who didn't have the means to pay for a funeral, they were put in this one area of the cemetery and buried there. And most of those, of course, don't have stones because the families couldn't afford to buy stones for them. And to the west of the church, Dr. Horsley also found 2 graves that were outside of the property boundaries of the church. So we're not exactly sure what happened there. I mean, you can't really, it is kind of hard to determine where the property line is on this property. So either there's some other kind of cemetery over there, or they were graves that were placed in an area that, they might not have known where the boundary was. So that's kind of interesting as well. So since he just completed that survey last week, it's going to take him a while to process the data, and then we should get a pretty good map of the extent of this burial ground. Susan, did you want to add anything about Mount Nebo?
No, I don't think so. Oh,
Okay.
there he is.
There, yeah, there he is down the hill there. And this just kind of shows you this, you can see where the land slopes off there, and there are a few markers kind of scattered about the cemetery, but there are probably a majority of the burials here are not marked. So again, hopefully his survey will show us the extent of the burials and help us to determine how many are located there. So the next cemetery we'll talk to you about is Simon Hill. So again, this is a property that came to our attention through the development review process. We have I guess a system where we ask for, we have a pre-application checklist. So when someone wants to, put in a development, they'll fill out our checklist and they'll tell us there are no historic sites here. There are no cemeteries here. And then I'll take a look at it and I'll do some research on the property and try to figure out what was there before. And I'll tell them whether they have to do an archaeology survey on the property. So in this case, I knew that there was a cemetery on this property, and it apparently had been moved by, it was a church cemetery shared by several churches. It's at the intersection of the BW Parkway and 450. So it's like, well, I know there's a cemetery. I knew there was a cemetery there. It was supposedly moved. I've heard horror stories about cemeteries being moved, and they're not all the burials being moved, in that project. So, so I said, I'm not convinced that that there aren't burials still there. So you're going to have to do an archaeology survey there. So this property owner had acquired the land from the state roads, the Maryland Department of Transportation. And so he was angry. It's like he called, SHA and said, you sold me this piece of land that had a cemetery on it and you didn't tell me. Well, they didn't know that had been a cemetery either. So so I went out to the property, and immediately when I walked on the property, I found a tombstone or two, that had been knocked over. And, that kind of makes sense because they didn't transport the tombstones with the burials. They were buried at Maryland National Cemetery near Laurel, and they were buried in a mass grave, the people who were removed. That was the story. So, so SHA agreed to check out the property to see if there were any burials there prior to this, this guy developing the property. And again, they did use a similar technique. They used a backhoe to scrape off the topsoil, and pretty soon, look at all those stakes. They start finding grave shafts, which you would expect, even if a burial's moved, you're still going to find the grave shaft. So they started excavating the grave shafts, and most of them were empty, but not all of them were. So let me get my notes here and give you the statistics on, if I can find it, how many burials were actually found there. I believe they found about, I think it was 128 grave shafts that they found. About 60 were empty. About another 20 or 30 were mostly disinterred, but there were still about 40 that were intact burials there that had not been touched. And there was one coffin that was, it was a metal coffin, and it had been sealed. And when they opened up the coffin, the body inside was pretty well preserved. I mean, it's like the woman had just been buried yesterday. So I think they were able to identify the woman in the coffin. And so all of these, the remains that were removed by the excavations by the State Highways Administration were taken up to Maryland National Cemetery, and they were buried together in a grave up there, not in the same spot as the original burials were placed, but in another grave. So kind of an unhappy situation there. But this shows you, these are the black or the intact burials. So you can see how many were left there. The gray are the partial burials, and then the white are the ones that were completely removed. So you can see they missed quite a few. Okay, so how are we how are we doing on time here?
Just about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes? Okay. All right.
It would
So
be good to mention, Jennifer, that the history of Simon Hill goes back to the St. Paul's Baptist Church in Bladensburg. So it has a long and important history in the Black history of the county.
Right, right. Yes, that was a very early African-American church, probably one of the earliest, I guess, in the county. Wouldn't you say, Susan?
And yeah, in the 1820s, yeah.
Yes, yep. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Addison Cemetery. This is a cemetery that you probably recognize the building in the back there. That was located in the Oxon Hill area. It's adjacent to where the MGM casino has now been built, and of course this cemetery was known before the casino was built. It was made one of our county historic sites in 2010. It was added to the historic sites and districts plan. So back in, I guess it was around 2014, when I guess MGM had gotten permission to build the casino, and they had actually, I think, started doing some of the work on it. We were approached by some of the lawyers from the Peterson companies who owned this parcel, and they asked if to give them some guidance on doing a ground penetrating radar survey on the property. So since it was a historic site, the Historic Preservation Commission had asked the Peterson companies to keep documentation on the cemetery. We wanted to make sure the grass was cut. We wanted to make sure the stones were kept clean and unbroken. And so I would go out with Daniel Filippelli, who was their consultant, and we go out there every 6 months and check the condition of the cemetery. So in 2014, Dr. Tim Horsley was retained to do a ground penetrating radar survey of the cemetery because we wanted to know the extent of the burials. The cemetery was kind of left on a hill. It's been graded all around. It was graded all around, and so the burials were left on this hill, and everything else is like 20 feet below this hill. So here's an aerial shot of it. This is from 2016. You can see the location of the Addison Family Cemetery next to the casino. And so back in the 1980s, and this is actually one of the first sites I worked on as an archaeologist. I had a summer job in 1984 with the Maryland State Highways, and this was, I didn't work on this particular cemetery, but I worked on the Oxon Hill Plantation. But anyway, in 1985, the archaeologists dug some of these backhoe trenches across the cemetery just to try to determine the extent of it. And they did identify some of the burials. It looks like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a possible 9th. So I guess they thought they had found the extent of the cemetery, or they just wanted to get a kind of an idea of how far the burials spread out from the center. So in 2014, Dr. Tim Horsley came in and did his GPR, and these are his results. So the ones that are really dark red are burials that he was pretty confident, anomalies that he thought he was pretty confident were actual burials. This doesn't show up really well on this picture, but they actually show up as orange, but they almost look red, but like these, they're kind of a little lighter orange here. Those he identified as possible burials, and then these yellow markers are tentative burials. So he wasn't sure those were real burials or not. But and he even picked up the earlier backhoe trenches that had been dug by the earlier archaeologists in 1985. So he picked those up in the survey as well, as long as these other linear features, which we never really figured out what they were, but we thought they might have been pathways that went around the cemetery and maybe between the rows of the individual burials. So this is the map of the burials that were found there. And let's see. Let me see if I can find my list of how many are actually in here. So you can actually see he also or they also found, this is the archaeologist excavated this area in November of 2019. And they identified a series of post holes here. So we believe that the cemetery was fenced at one time. And there seem to be these family clusters. So the earliest burials they found dated to the mid to late 18th century. And they were clustered in kind of in this area here. And then the cemetery expanded as members of the family died. And so they started to be buried more up in this area. And they think that this burial here was Walter Delaney Addison right here. And then his first wife on this side and his second wife on the other side. These burials here date to the late, or I guess the mid 19th century. And a lot of these, like the 1850s, 1860s, most of these burials had nameplates on them. So most of these burials could be identified. And again, I think they were grandchildren of Walter Delaney Addison. And then there were some outliers here, and we never figured out why. This one looks like it was outside of the fenced area. You can kind of see that the fence goes down this way and then it turns. And then there were two that were sort of set off by themselves here. And there's another one here. There were several double burials. This area here, there were some early to mid 18th century burials here that were interrupted by burials that dated from about 1815 to 1850. So apparently these burials must have had temporary markers. And so when later burials were put in, they didn't know they were there. And when they hit the earlier burials, what they did was they collected the bones out of the earlier burial, and they put the new burial in, and then arranged the burials or the bones of the earlier burial around the newer burial. So they didn't, just throw the bones away. They kept them in the same grave shaft. Over here, the same thing happened, and they collected the bones, and they actually dug another little hole over here and put the bones in that hole, and then they put the later burial on top of those. And this one was a double burial. We think these, it was I think a father and we think was a father and a child. It was a man and a child. So we think it was a father and a son who died about the same time, and they each had their own casket. One was buried, the child was buried on top of the other. So let's see, I'm still trying to find the number of burials that were identified in here. Okay, well, some of the burials over here that were from the 1870s. So so the burial ground started here, it moved to the north, and then it moved to the west, and then the latest burials were found in this area. There were, like I said, nameplates on these. The nameplates over here just had words like rest in peace, phrases like rest in peace and at rest. They didn't have actual names, so we're not exactly sure who those burials were. But it seems like after the 1870s, there were no additional burials being made in the Addison family cemetery, although the family retained title apparently to the property. So let me just go through these. All throughout this process, because there are still members of the Addison family in the area and around, we involved them in the process from the very beginning. They all thought it was best that the burials be moved because they didn't want them to remain next to a casino. They thought that was not a good idea, and that the stones and the burials might be damaged. So they came to a consensus that they should be moved to St. John's Church, which is about 3 miles south of where the Addison Cemetery is. And the Addisons were very active in this congregation. So they thought that this was the best place for them to go. And so the reverend at the church held a ceremony. Each burial was placed in its own little container, as you can see here, and there was an individual grave for each individual grave that came from the Addison Cemetery. And they were laid out in the same configuration as they were in the original cemetery. So we tried to, copy the same arrangement that was in the original cemetery. That's what the family wanted, and that's what happened. And so I think the family they didn't, I don't think they were pleased to see them move, but I think they feel much more comfortable to have them at the church where they'll have perpetual care. The stones were also moved, and were here you see that they haven't been re-erected, but they have been re-erected, and the stones were placed again in the same configuration as they were in the original cemetery. And one happy story was that some of the daffodils that were planted in the original family cemetery, they were, a lot of the daffodils were dug up by the archaeologists, and they were given to some of the family members. And one of the family members won a prize for the daffodil, one of the daffodils. She entered it into a contest and won a prize for the daffodil that came from the cemetery. So I think, are we out of time, or?
We are, and we do have a few questions if you have just a few more moments.
Okay.
All right. So our first question, how has the maglev affected the Prince George's County cemeteries?
Good question. It comes close to several of them. It's going to come out of the ground as it's proposed now. If it goes on the west side, it would be very close to the Hamilton family cemetery, which is in the city of Greenbelt. It's coming very close to that. They claim they're not going to disturb it, but I have my doubts. There is another cemetery on the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, which was a Methodist church site, an early Methodist church site. And they are proposing a what they call a laydown area. It's actually like a maintenance area. Well, they'll clean the cars and maintain, do maintenance on them during, when the trains aren't running. So there is a facility proposed on that. So that's one of the proposals, and that is coming very close to that cemetery. But the images aren't very clear where they're going to disturb. So those are two that could be affected by construction of the maglev in Prince George's County, at least.
Thank you. And our next question, do you have any information about who is buried in the Mcnamee Family Cemetery at the University of Maryland campus? As far as we know, there are two individuals buried there, a little boy named Albert, age 4, who died in a barn fire in 1904, and a woman named Martha Bryant Mcnamee, who died sometime before 1900. I would love to know if there are others who are also interred there.
Yes, I think I actually filled out a Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form. I did some research on that cemetery several years ago because the university inquired about it. And those, I think, are the only two that I was able to, confirm are probably there. I just looked at other, Mcnamees who may have been associated with that property, and I could not, most of them were buried in other cemeteries. So those were really the only two that I was confident that are buried there. I don't think there are others.
Thank you. And our last question, the 1853 side map of Riversdale shows an Indian burial ground. Do you have any information regarding this notation?
No.
No.
I think I'll have to take a look at that again, but a lot of that area has been developed, and it may have been in one of those areas, but I've never found the location of that burial ground or even really know where it might have been.
Thank you. And that's the last question in our chat box. We did get a question emailed to us. Is ground penetrating radar of any kind used in finding unmarked graves?
Yes. we had a few examples tonight, but yeah, it's the technology has really improved so much that you can literally tell where most of the burials are within a cemetery. It's really amazing. Like when I first heard of it, back in the 80s or so, it was really crude. but now the technology and it just keeps getting better. You know, they keep getting better and better machines, and it doesn't work in all types of soils though. There's certain types of soils it's not as effective on, like sandy soils, just because I guess the grave shafts don't hold their shape as well in sandier soils. But if you have the ideal type of soil, it's very effective.
Thank you. And Eileen, did you have your hand raised? Did you want to ask a question?
I did, thank you. Interesting presentation. What I'd like to know is whether there are any funeral homes that have records of the relocation of these burials, either in this century or in the 20th century.
Well, I don't. I know Gash's has a lot of Gash's funeral home in Bladensburg has a lot of funeral records, or Hyattsville, I guess. But I'm not sure that they really have any information on burials being removed. And I think the funeral home that moved the ones in the Simon Hill Cemetery, I think has gone out of business. And what happens to those? It was an outfit from, I guess it was a company that was located in Baltimore. And I'm not sure where those records go after these funeral homes go out of business. But it's a good question. I don't know of any, Susan. Do you?
Well, I know that the Prince George's County Genealogical Society has some records of moved burials, but I don't know how much they have or exactly how they got them. But what they are going to open, they're due to open before the end of this month. So you could actually call there and see, maybe find out.
Thank you.
And that seems to be all the questions that we have, Jennifer and Susan. So if no one else has any additional things to add, thank you all for joining us on this wonderful evening. Happy spring, everyone. And a huge thank you to Jennifer and Susan for taking some time out of their evening to hang out with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was fun.
And I was gonna say, I just want to put a plug in for our next history chat, on April 26th. John Peter Thompson will be chatting with Joseph Pruden as he talks about living in Cheverly in the 1950s. So hope you can join us for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.